I think it's fair to say that the 1990s were a bit of a desert for fantasy films. If on New Year's Eve '99 a dedicated fan had looked back on the best films of the decade, all they'd really have had was Disney's Beauty and the Beast, which, while a good movie, isn't exactly a swashbuckling high fantasy adventure, and Dragonheart, which got the fantasy bit right but failed on pretty much everything else. So you can imagine the trepidation in the late 90s when the news filtered through that Peter Jackson of Heavenly Creatures and Forgotten Silver fame, a New Zealander with a goblin's beard and a curious love of shorts, had taken it upon himself to fight the great Balrog and have a go at adapting J.R.R. Tolkien's masterpiece Lord of the Rings. The good news was that the two companies that greenlit the trilogy, New Line Cinema and Wingnut Films, put a bit of weight behind Jackson. $287 million in fact, and what that meant in practice was, I'm pleased to say, fantasy fans had something pretty special on their hands. Now in some circles you might be forgiven for saying you don't know what Lord of the Rings is. Not in this one, dear viewer. Saying you don't know what Lord of the Rings is around the movie Maverick is like saying you don't know who Darth Vader is at a Star Wars convention. But just in case there is anyone asleep at the wheel, here's a little breakdown. The movies are set in Tolkien's fantasy world, Middle-earth, a place where men, elves and dwarves live together relatively peacefully. A lot of time has passed in the world before the start of the films, whole mythologies in fact, during which the elves have risen and fallen, defeated foes and generally been heroic and wonderful. As part of this history, a terrible enemy, Sauron, has been downed but still festers in a land called Mordor, brooding over something he's lost, something pretty important to his plans to take over the world again, the One Ring. This is where Jackson's story begins. We join Frodo and Bilbo Baggins, two hobbits, a race of small friendly people living in underground houses in the equivalent of the English countryside, on the day of Bilbo's birthday. Joining them and their friends for the celebration is a stranger from a faraway land, the gruff wizard Gandalf, who realises that the disappearing trick played by Bilbo during his party is not achieved with a suite of Christopher Nolan practical effects, rather something more sinister, that pesky One Ring. Cue massive panic and a pretty serious race across the countryside for Gandalf to check whether he's right. He returns with bad news. The ring is the one. Big bad Sauron is waking up, and the only way to destroy it and stop Sauron from taking over the world is for someone to walk right up to his front door, knock politely and ask if they can throw it in the volcano he keeps in his back garden. The task falls to Bilbo's nephew Frodo, who recruits a couple of friends, gathers a very big bag of trail mix and gets on his way. During their journey they meet grizzled man Aragorn, ethereal elf Legolas and a dwarf called Gimli who rolls so many of his R's that his tongue might well end up with some kind of RSI. But will Frodo and the gang make it to Mordor, or will the ring's magic corrupt them on the way, allowing Sauron to rise once again? If the story to this sounds more like a fairy tale than a fantasy film for adults, then that does a deep injustice to what Jackson managed to achieve, because these are nuanced films, the likes of which we don't see in Hollywood much anymore. It would have been easy for Jackson to make his characters either all good or all bad, but he manages to resist this, creating instead multifaceted characters that keep the audience guessing. There are rivalries amongst the racers, old grudges that are played out in the story, and the ring is there all the way, egging them on. Indeed, the ring is at the heart of everything that happens in Lord of the Rings. It would have been easy to present it as an analogy for evil itself, and there is an element of that. It's the physical embodiment of Sauron's non-physical power, but the movies play with this notion. Is the ring evil, or does it merely allow the evil inherent in the different races of Tolkien's world out? The acting in the three movies is uniformly great. Jackson took the interesting decision of casting a good portion of the film's lead roles with relative unknowns, which has a wonderful impact on the audience's ability to immerse themselves in the story, rather than spend all its runtime wondering why Iron Man is suddenly a dwarf. Standouts go to Viggo Mortensen, who brings the male lead to life fantastically, and Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd, who play comic relief characters with so much warmth and humour that you can't help but smile every time they're on screen. This casting of unknowns doesn't mean Jackson avoided stars altogether, mind. Kate Blanchett is intimidating as hell as the Queen Galadriel, and the late Christopher Lee brings a glowering gravitas to Sauron's puppet Saruman. But the star of the movies is undoubtedly Ian McKellen as Gandalf, who grumbles and growls so grumpily through his performances that they went on to make him a cultural icon. Three movies set in a fantasy world wouldn't amount to much if the world itself wasn't brought to life well, and this is where the FX team at Weta absolutely excelled. If anyone else like me is utterly fed up of the CGI fest that modern movies have become, you're going to love the care and attention that were lavished on the practical sets and miniatures that make up the bulk of these films. Soaring mountains, rocky canyons, glittering forest elf cities, pitch black dwarven caverns, it's all in there, and like Howard Shore's music that goes along with it, it's utterly mesmerising and put modern movies to shame. It's not all perfect. The Lord of the Rings is split into 3 books, each as long as an iTunes terms and conditions agreement, and the films are long because of this. They don't get boring as such, but by the end of their 3-hour runtimes you're going to have a stun bomb and a need to offload so much urine, someone's going to have to let the water processing plant know in advance. The fight scenes, while meatily shot, who'd have expected anything less from Peter Jackson, are very violent and might put off some parents who are keen to watch the film with their kids. But these are just nitpicks, because the truth is, what Jackson and his team created with the Lord of the Rings trilogy was something very special indeed. Back in the early 2000s, it had been a long time since I'd watched a movie at the cinema and wanted to go back the next day to see it again, but these were 3 of those films. They're towering achievements in the fantasy genre that deserve all the praise and awards they got, and if you haven't seen them and have any sense at all in your internet adult brain, you'll go and watch them as soon as you can save up enough pennies to do so. Anyway, nothing more to say. This is Movie Maverick signing out.